Joining us for our webinar today. My name is Sarah Levin. I am the Director of Grassroots and Community Programs at the Secular Coalition for America. Our guest speaker today is Corinne Carey, the Campaign Director for Compassion and Choices. And we are very grateful to have Corinne today because she's going to be talking to us about how to message effectively, compassionately, in a compelling way on medicated dying. The Secular Coalition for America is a very good partner of Compassion and Choices. We've worked with their staff on the ground across the country, supporting their work to legalize medical aid in dying. A huge part of our success is messaging effectively and persuasively. And so we want to make sure that you have the tools to do that when you're speaking about this issue with legislators or the public, and Corinne is going to help us with that today. Very quick housekeeping. If you are logged into the platform, there is a chat box where you can ask questions, and we will be stopping throughout the presentation to hear your questions. So I'll be monitoring those and sharing those with Corinne. So please feel free to type a question as soon as they come to your mind, and we'll be sure to get to them. And without further ado, I will hand it over.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to share these messages with you. A few housekeeping tips of my own. Sarah, if you have any trouble hearing me or with the visuals at any point, just let me know. And I want to let participants know that I'll be stopping throughout the presentation to ask if you've got any questions. If you have trouble working the chat function, or if your question isn't picked, or if we miss you in some way, don't worry, I'm always available, and at the end of the presentation I'll share my contact information. My name is Corinne Carey, and I'm a campaign director with Compassion and Choices. I lead Compassion and Choices campaign in both New York and New Jersey, and in that capacity I have conversations with thousands of members of the public, hundreds of lawmakers, and many allies and potential allies, like some of you at a secular coalition. We could not do our work without the help of our partners. And so I really am grateful that you've agreed to host this webinar to learn how to deliver these messages, which are on one level very simple, and on another very tricky. So thanks once again. I'll just begin. Just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll share with you a little bit of CNC's vision and expertise. We'll talk a bit about knowing who your audience is, and I have audiences plural because there are so many different kinds of people that we talk to, and we alter our message slightly depending on the audience. We'll talk about some of the guiding principles of this work, and some do's and don'ts, what to say, what not to say, the importance of framing the message, and then the bulk of this webinar will be about talking tips and how to message certain tricky areas around medical aid and dying. I think it's pretty important to start out. I'll share that Compassion and Choices is a pioneer on this issue. We began our work on the country's first law in Oregon, which was enacted by a vote of the people through a public referendum nearly 25 years ago in 1994. The law didn't go into effect until 1998. Some of you may recall that there were a number of challenges at the federal level, but the original law was written in 93, passed in 1994, and Barbara Coombs Lee, who is the president of our organization, was one of the original authors of that bill. So we've got a lot of history and experience on this issue. I think it's good to sort of start out in the same place by talking about what is medical aid in dying, just so that we're all clear about what we're talking about. Medical aid in dying gives a terminally ill, mentally capable adult, there's always a typo, mentally capable adult with 6 months or fewer to live the option to request a doctor's prescription for medication that they can decide to take in their final days or weeks to end unbearable suffering and die peacefully in their sleep. This practice is sometimes referred to and is commonly known as death with dignity, but there is a reason that we have veered away from that language that I will share further on in the webinar. Medical aid in dying is an end-of-life care option that can peacefully end unbearable suffering when no other palliative care option will provide it. The practice is now authorized in 8 jurisdictions, and you see them here on the map. Most recently, Colorado, 2016, Washington, D.C. adopted a medical aid in dying law in 2016, and Hawaii just passed its state law authorizing the practice this year in 2018. Let's talk about audiences and who we speak to when we talk about this issue. Most commonly, we're talking to people who are already supporters. These include grassroots supporters, potentially supportive healthcare providers, lawmakers who are sponsoring or drafting bills, and allies like yourselves and other organizations. And the goal when talking to this group is engagement. It's important to always include a call to action when communicating with this group. So, for example, with grassroots supporters, there should always be an ask. Send a letter to your lawmaker, send an email, make a phone call. With healthcare providers, we have doctor sign-on letters, and we have the opportunity for doctors to join our National Doctors for Dignity program. With lawmakers, it's either to jump on as a co-sponsor or to introduce a bill. And with allies like the Secular Coalition, it's to join local coalitions on a statewide basis, bring folks to lobby days at state capitals, you know, blast out messages to your members. So whenever talking to these groups, you want to do a call to action. Another audience is the movable middle or neutral or conflicted audiences, people who have given some thought to this issue but haven't landed on either side. It's kind of sometimes it's rare to think about this audience because the issue is so polarizing that most people already have an opinion. But I find that if you allow enough space for someone to ask questions and talk, many people actually are in the movable middle. Many more people than you might imagine. We'll talk about this further on in the training, but you may hear a no in the beginning, but they really are someone in the movable middle, and that's how we ought to meet. Most of our audiences unless they're already known supporters. And the goal with these groups, with this particular group, is education and persuasion. Since our message is going to be heard by demographically diverse audiences, we try to avoid trigger words or otherwise problematic language and descriptions. The goal is really to convey respect for people's differing values around death and dying, and it's a key approach for us in messaging to a general audience. So, for example, we try to avoid using the word control because many people come to this issue believing that the only person that can control the time of one's death is God, for example. It may not be something that we believe as advocates, but it is something that someone that you're talking to that you don't know um, may believe that. And so you want to be careful about using the word control if you want to move that movable middle audience. We also try to avoid the word choice. Choice kind of signifies an impulsive uh, it has kind of impulsive nature to it, and it also evokes the pro-choice movement. Those folks are strong allies of ours. We share many values, but I can tell you that when we've had the word choice up at a table, for example, at a fair, many people pass us by because they think that we're either pro-choice or anti-choice, whatever those words mean, and they really don't much other than what society has given them, but choice has become a flashpoint. So we try to use option wherever we can. And we also try to avoid the term death with dignity. Now that may sound strange since this is the movement. The movement is known, you know, pretty widely by the term death with dignity. But it really is because some of the folks in the movable middle have had experiences in their lives and beliefs um, that what we're saying when we say medical aid in dying is death with dignity is that the only way to die with dignity is to use medical aid in dying, and that becomes offensive to people. And so we'll talk about the importance of using personal stories, but I often say that my father died with dignity because he died in a way that was consistent with his faith and his beliefs. He died at home, surrounded by his loved ones, and stubbornly not taking too much pain medication. And many people can relate to that when you use a personal story. But the key there is that my dad never would have chosen medical aid in dying, and yet and still he died with dignity because he died on his own terms. With specialized audiences, we're reaching out to groups of people to provide resources and information. So oftentimes we are asked to come in and talk about end of life planning. And when we do that, we use language that resonates more deeply with a particular demographic or an ideological group. We use stories that are relevant to their particular interests, and it really ranges. We've talked to groups that are right-leaning libertarian groups. We've talked to Baptist congregations, and each time you kind of want to be careful about the way that you talk about this issue and use examples that will resonate with those audiences. I think I'm going to stop here and see if anyone has any questions before I move on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about guiding principles. What we know is that people need and want a range of options at the end of life, including medical aid in dying. Recent independent polling data across demographic, political, and religious spectrums from Gallup, Lifeway Research, which is a Christian research organization, and Medscape proves this fact. And I'll just shift the polling data here. 72% of Americans support the right of a terminally ill adult to end their suffering at life's end. And that's from the most recent 2018 Gallup poll. 59% of Christian Americans and 70% of Americans of other faiths and religions agree that, quote, when a person has terminal painful disease, it is morally acceptable to ask for a physician's aid in taking his or her own life. Now, that is the question that Lifeway research posed, and you'll see that some of the language is not something that we would use. But Lifeway Research is a Christian polling organization, and these are the data that they found. And then from a fall 2016 Medscape poll, we found that 57% of US doctors support giving patients with an incurable terminal illness the option of medical aid in dying. Since I didn't hear Sarah, I think it would help give me some peace of mind to know you're on the other end. Sarah, can you just confirm that there are no questions so that I know that you hear me?
No questions at this time.
Thank you, that's helpful.
No
All
problem.
right. The other thing that we know is that most people believe that terminally ill adults should be able to make their own end of life care decisions based on their own faith or lack thereof, values, and beliefs, and in consultation with their doctor, their loved ones, and their faith and/or spiritual leaders. Research also tells us that when we fail to include the role of a person's family when sharing a story, our audience is likely to assume that the person's family is not involved and not supportive. One of the most common questions that we get is whether people who are asking for medical aid in dying have to inform their family, whether a family member can veto their decision. There's a lot of concern around that. And so it's better to include a person's family when talking about any stories, because we find that over 90% of people who ask for and use medical aid in dying in authorized states actually do involve their family. Family are very involved in this decision and in carrying out the final ingestion of the medication. Not by administering the medication, as we'll talk about later, but by being there to support that individual. Oftentimes you'll find opponents either in a public setting, generally in a protest stance, or people who will argue or try to argue with you about this issue. And what we find is that it's always better to take the high road. Casting aspersions on opponents when they twist the truth, which unfortunately they all do, makes us less credible to the public. And a calm and reasonable tone in response is never the wrong approach. I like to remind our supporters whenever we're in a public gathering that a lot of the opposition is born of fear, and that because we are a movement about compassion, that the goal is to treat our opponents with compassion and assume that that opposition is based on fear and misunderstanding. And you may not be able to change someone's mind, but treating them with compassion is never the wrong approach. So, a few do's and don'ts. One of the first things we learned in doing our research is to not attack institutions or beliefs. Many of us want to argue about the separation of church and state. It's something that I think has been devalued in our current society, or the morality of medical options. But if we attack the church, whatever that church is, we undermine support that we may find there, because people tend to defend groups that they're a part of when the group is attacked. Now, we know, for example, that the Catholic Church is under quite a bit of fire now. But I know from talking to my own mother that attacking the church, even if she shares some of those beliefs, only drives her further to defend it. And so it really never works to attack any church. Another don't is to blame doctors. When it comes to medical aid in dying, people think that doctors should be able to opt out, but they don't believe that healthcare institutions should be able to prohibit the practice. I'll share with you one small story. I was giving a presentation to a group of doctors in a society in New York City. And I told the story of my father, which I often do. And I said that the doctors suggested continuing courses of chemotherapy. And in retrospect, we've learned from much research that oftentimes when you continue chemotherapy, um, you may reduce the quality of life and even shorten the time that someone has to live. When treatments like that stop working, um, it has adverse effects. Well, I can tell you that that go over well in a room full of doctors. They felt that they had been blamed as a group for the reduction in the quality of life of my father. So even in anecdotes, blaming doctors is never a good idea, particularly in front of doctors. Now, another note I'll say is that many people trust doctors. Lawmakers do not trust doctors. And so while you're trying not to blame doctors, if you're talking to lawmakers, you will often hear a lot of blame on doctors for misdiagnoses, misprognoses, et cetera. So you really have to know your audience. But even though I would encourage you never to blame doctors, you are to hear it from lawmakers if you talk to them. Another don't is to debate the legislation line by line. Many opponents will try to trip up advocates, particularly advocates who are not well versed in legislation, by pointing to different provisions. And what we always advise people is to making the case for why the law is needed by telling the stories of dying people and those who have suffered. An easy way to handle that is to say, you can talk to the bill sponsor about that. I'm telling you why this law is needed. And the other stock answer to that is that this bill, whatever bill it is, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Delaware, is based on the tried and true model from Oregon, which has been in place for over 20 years and has never had to be amended. It has never been expanded. It's never been fixed. So that's a very easy way for any layperson to respond to a debate on legislation that opponents try to drag us into. You do want to leave room for people to change their minds. We have to remember that we support the ability of all people to have the options that are right for them. And many times, if you allow folks the space, they will move towards a position of agreeing that everyone should have this ability. So you want to leave that room for someone to change their mind, and arguing with someone almost never allows that room. It pits right against wrong, and that generally does not work. I think I'll stop here and ask if there are any questions.
I don't see any right now.
Okay. One thing to remember is avoiding language about life-ending medication or taking medication to end one's life. Just like as I said, the Lifeway survey that we saw earlier, we'd never use that language because it's the disease or the illness that is ending the person's life, not the medication. Use medical aid in dying instead of physician aid in dying because the latter term implies that the doctor administers the medication, which is construed as euthanasia. Compassion and Choices does not support euthanasia, which is illegal nationwide. And the reason we don't is because the patient doesn't administer the medication. And one of the things that is very important to us in our philosophy and in our advocacy is the notion of patient autonomy, that it is really the patient that's in the driver's seat, that's in control. And euthanasia is not that. The importance of framing the message. Our research tells us that if we don't provide a context for an individual story or a factual point, our audience will fill in the blanks by assuming the worst. And one of the things that, one of the ways that this plays out is when you don't mention a person's family. So they will assume that if you're just talking about them, that they're making a very selfish decision and their family is not involved. So you want to frame the message and sort of if any folks on the webinar are lawyers, sometimes you think about it in terms of drawing the sting. That if there is an unanswered question, you want to kind of answer that question in the way that you frame the message and tell the story. So if in telling your story there's a hole or a blank, you kind of want to try to figure out how to address that. One of the things that we learned in our research, and early on, we didn't talk about how the medication is ingested, but we found that people need to understand the medical aid in dying process, and we find that it's very helpful to explain the process simply in order to demystify it. And some of the most powerful messengers, and they are a growing group, are those whose loved ones have used the medication in other states. When our assembly in New York held hearings on this issue, we had 4 storytellers, each whose loved one um, took the medication in an authorized state. So we had someone whose loved one took it in California, in Vermont, in Oregon, and in Montana. And it's very powerful. Dan Diaz, because his wife Brittany Menard used the medication in Oregon, is one of our most powerful storytellers. So, the most simple line is that the medication enables the terminally ill person to die peacefully and end unbearable suffering and gently die in their sleep. But you can, if you know about how the medication is used, you can go a little further, and you will be prompted probably by questions to say that the person ingests the medication usually by mixing it in water and drinking it directly out of a glass or using a straw. If their breathing slows down, and then they drift off to sleep, usually within minutes, until eventually their breathing stops within an hour or two, and that it is a very peaceful death. None of the legislation across the country specifies what kind of medication that is used. That's just smart legislative drafting because medical practices change all the time, and you wouldn't want to preclude a newer, better kind of medication or cocktail of medication that may come along in the future. And also prices change. So some of the most commonly prescribed medication, once the law became once the practice became legal in California, there was price gouging, and some of that medications, the price of the medication dramatically increased. I can tell you one of the most common um, um, formulations of medication that people are prescribed is a combination of medication. One, a pro-absorption drug that you take 45 minutes prior to the final medication, an anti-nauseal that you also take 45 minutes before, because the medication is very bitter and causes a gag reflex. And then finally, 45 minutes to an hour later, you take the medication. It's really interesting sometimes to get into the details here if you're well versed in it, because people are very concerned about coercion. And if you know enough about the medication and how it's self-ingested, you can explain that it would be very difficult to force someone to take a medication that tastes so awful, is so bitter, and that if you drink it too slowly, you'll fall asleep with the medication becoming effective. Or the more effective way to do it, if you're not as well versed or don't have the personal experience of sitting at the bedside, is to point to the clinical practice guidelines that were published by the Journal for Palliative Medicine in 2015. And so if anyone wants a copy of those guidelines, I'd be happy to share them. Another thing that's really important is to clarify why people opt for medical aid in dying, and to make sure to not find the reasons too narrowly. Many people make the mistake of saying that it's a fear, it's pain, it's the avoidance of pain that is the reason why we need medical aid in dying. But while fear of pain is a reason that people choose medical aid in dying, it's not the most common one. And so if you get a well-versed opponent, and many of them have been trained, just as we're going over these talking points, they'll be told that it's very easy to point to the Oregon Death with Dignity data that was collected by the Oregon Health Authority that shows that the top three reasons that dying people cite when they request medical aid in dying includes specific forms of suffering like loss of autonomy, no pleasure in living, and loss in dignity. And they will very astutely point out that none of those have anything to do with pain. So while these reasons have everything to do with suffering, they don't have anything to do with physical pain. As a result, when talking about the reasons that people choose medical aid in dying, it's important to talk about pain and symptoms management. But if you wanted to get into the weeds, the Oregon data actually show that people typically cite 3 to 4 reasons for seeking medical aid in dying. And so their collective reasons total nearly 400%. If people gave only one reason, the total would be 100%, and our opponents would be right that pain is not up there. But most people include pain within the 3 to 4 reasons of seeking medical aid in dying. So we need to emphasize that people request it for relief of both pain and suffering. But better than pointing to data, when you have real life stories of people who have suffered pain, and now with the campaigns that we have running in Massachusetts and New York and New Jersey, unfortunately, we have a number of people who are dealing with terminal end stage illnesses that have much experience with pain and suffering and know what they can bear and what they can't. And perhaps just as importantly, the side effects of medication that they need to take to control that pain. And those side effects cause real suffering. And that suffering has nothing to do with the loss of ability to engage in daily activity, which is a tricky subject that we'll turn to in a few moments. So that's a lot of complicated stuff. I think I'll stop again and ask if there are questions.
I hope you don't mind if I ask a question, Corinne. I was wondering in terms of language, I know you said not to say to end one's life, for example. What about hasten? I've seen hasten one the process or something like that. Is that a no-no as well?
It's not a no-no. It's not. I think the ending the life is tricky because it's the disease that's ending the life. It's the illness that's ending the life, not the medication. But sometimes it's hard to stay from because, in reality, the medication does both hasten and cause death.
Great, thank you. And I do
So,
have one more I just thought of from a few slides ago when you were talking about legislators blaming doctors. And I do have experience with this, and I'm curious what's the best way to respond when you're talking to a lawmaker at their office and they're pulling out very specific anecdotes of misdiagnoses? What's the best way to respond to that talking point?
misdiagnoses in particular, there are two, there may be more, but the two that initially come to mind. One is that there is a study, trying to think of what the publication is, but I can certainly share it with you. A study that shows that indeed opponents are correct in one sense, that the majority of prognoses that doctors give are flawed. But the interesting thing is that they're flawed in favor of predicting more time rather than less. Doctors are more likely to tell someone that they have more time to live than they actually do. The tricky part about that is that we all know people who've outlived a prognosis. And there are different ways to respond to that. One is that that's what we all hope for. But generally speaking, the dying person knows when they are able to take no more. Misdiagnoses, the way to respond to that is by talking about the fact that people seek second opinions, they seek third opinions because they don't want to be terminally ill. But the bills themselves require, all of the bills require two doctors confirm both the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the person's capacity to make medical decisions. So those are a couple of ways to respond. There will be lawmakers who will just persist with that. They have a personal experience, they have a block based on their own faith or belief, that it's going to be very difficult to move them away from that. And that's just a reality.
Thank you. I don't see
Does
any
that
other
answer?
questions right now. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, great. One thing that is really good to talk about is who benefits from medical aid in dying laws. And a key talking point is that relatively few people, less than 1% of all people who are terminally ill, ultimately take aid in dying medication. But many terminally ill adults indirectly benefit from these laws because they improve end of life care overall. Many people report that simply having the option of medical aid in dying can decrease fears and the feeling of powerlessness that individuals dying from terminal illnesses often report, enabling them to live their final days as fully as possible. We've even heard stories of people who obtained the aid in medication, put it in the medicine cabinet, and felt freer to pursue experimental treatments or drug trials because they knew that there was a door if the side effects from those treatments got too terrible. They may not have pursued those treatment options if they didn't have this medication in the cabinet. So it's definitely reported by families and others who are still living as giving them a tremendous amount of peace of mind. Journey stories are really, really important. There are many people who were once opposed to medical aid in dying until they watched a loved one suffer needlessly. And this experience enabled them to get a new perspective about how this option provides relief to a dying person. By using journey stories, we accept people's inner conflict and we model how they can resolve this conflict to allow options for others. Sometimes, um, say more about sometimes you will find people who are just an immediate, absolute no. I've even had people literally put up the hand, not with a no written on it, but they just put up the hand and say, "Oh no, that's not me," or "I don't believe in that," or "My faith prevents me from supporting that." And dealing with this kind of a response, context really matters. If you are in a rushed area, we do a lot of tabling at events. It is really not worth it to try. You just let someone go and say, I respect your opinion. It's not worth engaging. But if you're in the middle of a conversation, This is a fantastic opportunity to engage someone and get them to expand a little bit. And for each of these reactions, the most common three reactions, there's a response. When someone says, oh no, that's not for me, that's fine. Once these laws pass, those who disagree with them for themselves, nothing will change. No one can suggest that the patient is the one who requests medical aid in dying. If someone says, I don't believe in that, the person doesn't, you don't have to believe that. You just have to believe that no one should be able to stand in someone else's way of exercising this option. And if someone says, my faith prevents me from supporting that, generally speaking, that's fine. I would never imagine that someone would sign a petition, for example, asking for lawmakers to bring an aid in dying bill to the floor. But the fact is, the majority of people of faith support allowing people to make their own decisions about end of life care. And in fact, that allows all of us to make decisions that are based on our own faith or lack thereof and values and beliefs. And there are very few people who would disagree with that if it's properly framed. One of the best examples is Governor Jerry Brown. His signing statement when the California law was on his desk is a great example of how to model support for the option of medical aid in dying, even when personally conflicted about whether a person would use the option. Governor Brown trained as a Jesuit priest, and when the bill reached his desk, we had no idea where he would stand. But what he did was issue an incredibly eloquent statement that read, I do not know what I would do if I were dying in prolonged and excruciating pain. I am certain, however, that it would be a comfort to be able to consider the options afforded by this bill, and I wouldn't deny that right to others. And I contend that in conversations with people who initially expressed doubt or opposition to the bill, many of those people can get to this place with compassion and with a little bit of space. For that reason, you want to leave room for people to change. Messages that are too certain, that lack nuance, and that fail to mirror a person's inner conflict can be alienating. That's why we talk about options. So I would encourage you just to always leave room for people to change their minds. Another important point to make is that it really isn't about dying. You want to use messages that help people distinguish between suicide, for example, and medical aid in dying. And the way to do that is to say that people commit suicide when they have mental health problems or crises so severe that they don't want to live. People who use medical aid in dying, on the other hand, are mentally sound and want to live, but a terminal disease is killing them. They use medical aid in dying to peacefully end an unbearable dying process. Assisting suicide remains illegal in all of the states that have authorized medical aid in dying. These laws don't eliminate assisted suicide laws, and in fact, the laws specifically clarify that medical aid in dying is not suicide or assisted suicide under the law. One of the things that I'm very interested in is developing messaging around the fact that we share values with the anti-suicide folks, because we know that people who are terminally ill take their own lives in sometimes violent ways that damage their communities and their families for generations. And so we share the value of preventing those kinds of suicides. And in fact, when medical aid and dying laws are in place, although we don't have data to show this, people are not left with no option if they are suffering an unbearable pain or other kinds of suffering at the end of life. I think Dan Diaz, the husband of Brittany Menard, has said it best when he said that medical aid in dying does not cause more people to die. It just allows more people to peacefully stop needless suffering at life's inevitable end. Now, I have run across people who think that there is always hope and that life does not have an inevitable end. people, but I've also talked to some folks who are super into medical advanced science fiction who believe that there is no inevitable. But for most people, they know that none of us are getting out of here alive, and that allowing medical aid in dying doesn't cause more people to die. This statement that Dan so brilliantly pulls out at really opportune moments captures the feeling that all of us, or that most of us know to be true. Reverend Dr. Paul Smith, who's a Presbyterian minister and a civil rights advocate, also said that aid in dying isn't about death, it's about how we spend our final days of life. That everyone deserves a dignified death, no matter what end of life option they choose. So I often use this quote as well. Another sentence that families use is, I would have done anything I could to help my wife live longer, or my sister, or my mother, or my daughter. Um, but in the end, her suffering was so great, I supported her wish to die peacefully, surrounded by her family. It's really hard to disagree with someone who says that. Very important to use messages that acknowledge the importance of honoring and respecting a person's decision, even if you wouldn't the same decision. And again, repeating the message that those who are dying should be able to make their own decision in consultation with their loved ones, healthcare providers, and spiritual leaders. And when medical treatments can't cure the disease or provide relief from suffering, we should honor and respect the dying person's wishes for their final weeks or days. I have developed a very quick speech that I give at tables, for example, when you only have people for a few seconds to catch attention, and I say, um, medical aid in dying allows someone to say to their doctor, "Look, if you can't cure me, and you can't relieve my suffering, I'd like the option of asking you for a prescription for medication that I can take at a time of my choosing to die peacefully on my own terms." And that kind of quick elevator, not even an elevator, table talk speech captures many of the values that we've gone over already in this webinar. Urgency is another thing that's really important to convey, to make the case that dying adults need lawmakers to authorize medical aid in dying as soon as possible before it's too late to access the option to peacefully end suffering. The most compelling call to action results from the stories shared by those who are terminally ill now. Their loved ones can also make the urgency clear. And as I said, unfortunately, in the states that have had campaigns, we now have people who've passed waiting for law to be approved, and people who are suffering now. So making the point that medical aid in dying is an urgent issue for terminally ill adults who can't wait for relief from unbearable suffering in their final days, and that without the option, many terminally ill people will suffer needlessly instead of dying peacefully. He was an advocate in New York. He recorded a video from his hospital bed, talking about the pain that he was in and the way that he would like to die. And then we interviewed his partner, who described the way that he did, in fact, die, which was quite horrific. And so, unfortunately, as advocates, we are finding more of these stories, and the longer these campaigns drag on, the more there are. So, rest in peace, Jay, and we advocate on your behalf. Another thing that is really beneficial is to emphasize the broad benefits of these laws, to proactively promote the positive outcomes from medical aid in dying. And the fact is that authorizing medical aid in dying improves care for everyone. The Los Angeles Times last summer published an article uh, with the headline, "There's an unforeseen benefit, California's physician-assisted death law." And this was right after some of the early statistics came out with regard to implementation in California. And part of the article stated, physicians across the state say the conversations that health workers are having with patients are leading to patients' fears and needs around dying being addressed better before. They say the law has improved medical care for sick patients, even those who don't take advantage of it. And this is true. As advocates, this is not an unforeseen benefit. This is a very expected benefit and a benefit that we've seen in Oregon for years. There are a number of articles that show end of life care has improved overall since the implementation of that state's Death with Dignity Act, in large part due to the dialogue the act encourages between people and their doctors. Um, People who are dying can be frank about what they want and the way that they want to die. There's fear around expressing what they may want and how they may want to exit this life. It opens up those conversations. Another tip is to avoid rights-based language, which is really hard for me. I spent 10 years with the Civil Liberties Union, and so the idea that we aren't talking about the right to die is sometimes difficult. But the average person doesn't think about death in terms of legal rights. Love and family are more valued by most people than equality or rights. But we're learning this in many different areas of social justice. So rights-based language may be right, but it does resonate with that movable middle that I was earlier. This is a really important point. Whenever we're advocating for medical aid in dying, we want to avoid ableist language. And by ableist, I mean language that privileges able-bodied people over people who are living with um, various degrees of mobility or abilities. You want to avoid elevates concerns about consequences for people with disabilities or appear dismissive of conditions that people with disabilities live with every day. When we share personal stories, we should focus on the irreversible course of the disease that will soon kill the person who desires to use medical aid in dying. And I'll give examples here. A couple of things not to say, and this comes from working with many, many people who have shared their stories publicly or testified in front of the legislature. And these are very natural things for people to say because they may be true to the person's or the experience of their loved one. So, two examples. Left to run its course, her tumor would have produced horrific symptoms, worsening seizures, risk of losing the ability to communicate, going blind, paralysis. In a word, torture. Another example is my mother suffered terribly. She could no longer walk, and she suffered the indignity of having someone help. Both of these descriptions of conditions might be utterly true to the individual, but they are painful for people with disabilities to hear. And one of the most important things at this stage in our movement is to garner the support of high-profile people with disabilities. We know from polling that the majority of people living with disabilities want these same options, but leaders in the disability rights community have really band together and are among our most formidable opponents. The last thing we want to do is feed those misconceptions. So these are examples of personal stories that could be seen as disrespectful or offensive to someone who lives without being able to walk on their own, with paralysis, experiencing seizures, or someone who needs assistance in toileting. Those things are not in and of themselves undignified or signify a lessening of a quality of life. I realize I have said a lot, so I'm going to stop again and ask if there are any questions or comments.
One question I have, Corinne, that I heard as an objection from a DC council member who opposed the Death with Dignity Act that was passed was she argued that people with less means would not would that there was some inherent inequality because they can't afford the health care that others might have who have more means to pursue those options that would lengthen their life and that sort of stuff. Basically, pointing out that it's expensive to seek those medical treatments, that may prolong your life or save your life. And so her argument was that people of lower means would end up choosing this option more often, or this would be their only option because they can't afford, the others. Which, of course, my thought was, well, it's not the responsibility of this movement to improve the entire healthcare system to make it more affordable for everybody. That seemed like a kind of bigger issue, but I do wonder what would be the most appropriate response to that particular talking point.
Well, I would say that it's a very effective argument on the part of our opponents. It is the argument that in this day and age, with attacks on the Affordable Health Care Act and risks to Medicaid and Medicare, it is the argument that resonates the most with our progressive opponents. But in fact, I would take you back to Dan Diaz's statement. Um, Insurance companies need no additional incentive to deny us coverage for care. Um, it is a reality right now that some people can afford better medical care than others. But the end result of that is that people are dying. So if you can't afford the kind of medical care that your neighbor can, that doesn't mean that you're going to ask for medical aid and dying. That simply means that you're likely to die and die without medical aid and dying in a great deal of pain and suffering if you don't have that option. And so, really, if you deconstruct that argument and acknowledge that it is true that healthcare disparities persist, you have to then think through what the end result of that is. And right now, people who can't afford quality medical care are dying. We are not preventing that by preventing access to medical aid and dying, and we're not hastening those deaths by allowing for medical aid and dying. We are simply allowing people who are dying, unjustly or not, sooner or later, with an additional option. Medical aid and dying doesn't cause an incentive for insurers to deny care, and it certainly doesn't um, provide an incentive for people to ask for it. And the statistics don't bear it out. I mean, as much as most people who are making emotional argument don't want to look at the statistics, the majority of people who actually use medical aid and dying are health literate, with advanced degrees, insured, and people who are not living in poverty. And again, for better or for worse, but that's what the data tells us. Hopefully, those are some ideas for how to answer that very effective argument from our opponents.
That's great. Thank you. I don't see any other questions.
Okay. So let's talk about some language issues. We talk about self-ingesting the medication versus self-administering it. In public communications, we want to make clear that the person must be able to self-ingest the medication. Self-administer is used in most states' laws and used in documents geared towards legal and healthcare professionals. But administer evokes an image of having something done to you or an injection. When communicating with the general public, we want to talk about taking the medication or self-ingesting the medication to avoid negative and inaccurate images. Also, we talk about safeguards with legislation. Knowing that safeguards are included in medical aid and dying laws is an important component of garnering lawmaker and voter support. In fact, medical aid and dying legislation includes typically over safeguards. But the law is meaningless if a person can't access it. So what we know, I think this is on the next slide, CNC supports core safeguards, but our goal is to prevent additional regulatory burdens that would impede terminally ill adults from accessing this end of life care option. And one example is Washington, D.C. The law took effect more than 18 months ago, but the Washington Post recently reported that not one terminally ill adult had been able to access it, even though district officials estimated about 10 people would do so during the first year. The fact is, the law's administrative rules are too burdensome and complicated for both doctors and patients. And in the final days of negotiating the bill, DC health officials added requirements, including psychological evaluations, registration for doctors, and online training for patients and doctors. Some of these things, particularly the registration of doctors who don't want to be known as being Dr. Kevorkian or someone who practices in this area, public registration deters doctors from engaging in this practice. So lawmakers are maybe well intentioned by wanting to add more and more safeguards, but it has to be balanced against allowing people to access the law, which is what I just said. So this is that slide. It's important to find that right balance. I think a parting message for me here is that silence is golden. Giving your listener the time to ask questions, express doubts, and think out loud is really important. After hearing answers to their questions, many people will talk themselves into supporting the notion that everyone should have the ability to make their own end of life decisions. I'll share a very quick anecdote. I was meeting with a lawmaker, an African American lawmaker in an urban area, and he said to me, "I just don't think my constituents agree with this." And I said, "Well, actually, I've talked to many of your constituents at fairs and festivals and public events, and the conversation usually goes that they say it's not for them, but then they start asking some questions. And at the end of the day, they realize that no one should be able to make that decision." And I didn't use this as a tip for you today, but one of the things you could say is that it never really works out well when someone else is making decisions for you at the end of life. People value being, being the driver in the driver's seat. And he said, "Well, let's test that out." And he called in his administrative assistant. And I mean, that this is like showtime, right? I had to prove that what what I told him I heard out in the community would play out exactly that way in front of him. And so he said, "Monique, what do you think about medical aid in dying, allowing someone to ask for medication that ends their life?" And she said, "Oh no, absolutely not. That is not something I agree with." And I didn't say anything. And she started asking me questions. And I said very little. I answered her questions with facts. And lo and behold, she talked herself into it. At the end of the day, she said something very similar to what Jerry Brown said, Governor Jerry Brown. She said, if someone is suffering and they're asking for this, who am I to say that they can't have it? It was quite a moment. But that same conversation has played out many, many, many times. And part of the reason it does is that you allow the person to talk it through for themselves. And many, many times they will come out in the same way that Jerry Brown did. So with that, um, we'll end pretty much on time. Ask if there are any questions, and you can see my contact information here. Uh, if you have any questions in the future or would like any supporting documents, I have the answers to pretty much any question that you'll ask me in the future. Um, Sarah, are there any closing questions or thoughts?
I don't see any, but I have to say I learned a lot during this presentation myself. I might have some follow-up questions myself. So I just really appreciate you taking the time to go through this. And we'll definitely be sharing this with a lot of folks on the ground who I know care very much about this issue. And we could definitely tighten up our language and take your advice. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. We really appreciate it and all the work you do on the ground.
Thank you for allowing me to do it, and good luck. I'm appreciative of your partnership.
Great. Thank you again, Corinne. And please, if you have any follow-up questions, the slide in front of you has her contact information. Please feel free to reach out. And please continue to do your work and support compassion and choices every way you can on the ground. And with that, that's our webinar today. Have a great week, everyone.